As we move forward, my portion here won't be hopefully as long as it was the last time. Last time was mostly an introduction, but even just watching our groups kind of get together and take off, it seems like the conversation flows. And really that's what this is about. It's about having an opportunity to be with one another and good conversation. Thanks for taking on the book this week, and I hope that you were able to have a chance with some of the sleep exercise. I know sleep is such a funny thing because we don't often think of that as a spiritual activity. I was reminded this week, I think it was something Eugene Peterson talked about. He said every time we go to sleep, we are practicing resurrection. This is an interesting idea. When we go to sleep, right, the world sort of ceases to exist for us, and in the morning we wake up and the world is there. We are practicing for the day that when we pass, right, we'll wake up. And when we wake up, we will be in that great resurrection. And so every day that we go to sleep and we wake up the next day, it's an act of practicing. It's an act of hope. It's an act of surrender. I really thought it was interesting, and I mentioned it in the sermon, that our author talks about sleep is not something you do so much as it's something you let happen, right? You let it happen in you. You can't force yourself to go to sleep. You can only create conditions in which sleep sort of overtakes you, or those types of things. So I hope that was meaningful for you. So the big idea, and this is in the Leader's Guide. The big idea for the chapter that we just went through is that most people want to change, but fail to change, not because they're not trying, but because they're not training properly. Or the way I would say that, they're not creating the environment that would allow change to happen. Before we get to that, I just want to remind you of two purposes, just this time, because we went through this last week. Just two quick reminders about what we are about in these small groups that we're doing. The first purpose is the purpose of the book itself that we're going over, the book Good and Beautiful God. This study is intended to create space leading us to spiritual transformation by replacing false narratives about God with true narratives revealed in Jesus Christ. And when the false narratives are replaced, our spiritual thirst can be quenched by the truth of our living God. We spent some time talking about various false narratives that we have had in our lives and false narratives that we have over time let go of. And we talked about that some last week. And then just the second purpose, the purpose of doing this exercise as a small group. You could certainly buy this book and go through it on your own. I did that once and it was fruitful. It was a meaningful thing. But the idea of doing this in small groups, it's really based in both those passages from Hebrews and from the book of Acts that has this foundational sense. We read this last week. It has this foundational sense that our faith is something that we do as a community. It's not something we do on our own. The first church was devoted to teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and to pray together. That's from Acts chapter 2. There's this mutual care and mission that we engage in when we come together. That's what we see, and that's why we're trying this activity, that we can move through this exercise, these attempts of replacing false narratives about God with true ones, and we can do it with one another. So, just a reminder of why we're doing it this way. The title of the chapter is, What Are You Seeking? When I do small groups, or often when I've begun small groups, I begin with a question that I put in front of people. This is usually for groups that are maybe either mid-age or older, not so much with younger groups, but I ask this question. I say, what would the 20-year-old version of you think of who you are today? Does that make sense? What would the 20-year-old version of you think of who you are today, what you've become, how you've lived your life? For some, the answer would be, well, I think they'd be proud. I think they'd be excited. I think they'd be excited to know that that's the life that has ended up being lived. They might be grateful. Oh, that's really cool. I got to experience this or that, or I interacted with these people. I got to go to these places, those types of things. So sometimes those are the answers. But often the answers have a sense of disappointment to them, actually. I see some heads nodding, and I won't point those heads out. But that's a pretty common response. In fact, I remember meeting with a group of men all in their 40s actually, and this was almost a haunting question, because so many of us, when we reflected on that, felt some sort of letdown, some sort of sense of, oh wow, I was really hoping for something more. I was hoping that life would have more, and they were generally happy with their jobs and their families and those types of things, but it was just sort of like this sense of, is this it? Is this it? Is this all there really is to life? Sort of that sense of recognizing there is a deeper thirst. There's something more in us. And then we took stock of that. So, well, why is that? And then how do we go from here so that we might, 20 years from now, look back and say, you know what, I'm really grateful that I took on those different things, or I made these adjustments, or I moved closer to God. So the chapter begins with this overview, with these questions. And it's sort of the questions you might ask if you were thinking about what would I hope the future me reflects on. At this point, the question so it begins with: would you like abiding peace? Would you like to have a heart full of love? Would you like to have the kind of faith that sees everything, even failures and losses, in light of God's governance for good? The guys that I remember going through this with, who largely were a little saddened by my question, what would the 20-year-old version of you think of who you're becoming? I think when they reflected on that opening chapter, they said, I'm not able to say yes to these questions. I would like that, but I don't have that right now. And that set the context for our time together. I remember I was thinking about the first time when I was a young person, my understanding of what the purpose of life was all about. I think I was like 4 or 5 years old. I was pretty young. I don't even remember what our church life as a family was at that point. We were living in California before we moved to Pittsburgh when I was 5 years old. But I remember having this idea in my head that the goal of life was to make it to heaven. Right? That was my greatest search. The goal of life, the purpose of life, is to make it to heaven. I remember thinking, okay, well, if I better do everything I possibly can so that I get to heaven, right? And the 5-year-old me translated that to try to be nice, try to do the things that people asked me to do. But it also the spiritual discipline that I remember taking on as a 5-year-old is I knew the Lord's Prayer. And I said it each and every single night when I was laying in my bed. It was after my parents put me to sleep. I can remember laying there thinking, oh, I got to say the Lord's Prayer before I go to bed. But all of that, and I mean, there was good in that, right? But all of that effort was about this sort of possibility that it was about working towards this place called heaven, and I better make sure I'm doing all of these things. Looking back, I recognize that there was good in that, but by and large, that was a false narrative, right? That was a false narrative that even at 5 years old, I had totally bought into. I had totally thought that my purpose was to do all the right things to get God's approval. So it was a little bit later on that I recognized, probably not until high school or maybe even college, that God's intention for our lives was not just about what happens after we die, right? That there actually was a sense of purpose and intention for what God would have us do in our lives today. And if that's the case, then it's worth these exercises that we're doing. It's worth looking at how are we living and whether it's in line with God's intention. The word is transformation. I mentioned that in the sermon today. The word is transformation. This is what we desire. This is what we are looking for. Now, my question for you is, when you think of if our purpose in the Christian life is transformation, what are we being transformed? What do we hope to be transformed into? So that's an open question. What are some ideas? What would we hope to be transformed into?
I want more patience.
More patience. Okay. Transform me, Lord, so that I can live with more patience. Okay, great.
Peace.
More peace. Yeah. There's a lot of anxiety in the world, isn't there? Yeah, I definitely feel that. Some that are measuring, the sleep exercise that we did. What causes a lack of sleep? A lot of times it's angst. It's anxiety, right? The idea is that sleep in heavenly peace that we'll sing at Christmas, right? What a beautiful idea. But that has the sense that the anxiety is put away, and so we can rest. What else? What do we hope for when we think? Relaxation. To go along with the peace. Yeah, relaxation, I maybe in line with, it's not up to me to make the world go around. I can sort of let God take care of that, and I can do my, okay.
The Bible answer would be transformed into the image or likeness of Christ.
Into the image or likeness of Christ. That's a very, that's the big idea, right? The whole idea, even behind that word Christian, has had an original context of little Christs, right? So when the people in Antioch, said, first called the group of believers the Christians, that's where the word shows up in the book of Acts. It's the first time our movement was called the movement of the Christians. It was this idea that they're all about trying to be these little Christs, being transformed into the image and likeness of Christ. Yeah. Any other specific? I mean, that's a great. Any other specifics though, for you? Image and likeness of Christ. Christ was patient. Christ was at peace. Christ was able to relax into who his identity was. Any other specifics jump out at you? Joyful. Yeah. That's a good one, isn't it? What would allow us to be more joyful, do you think? Being more Christ-like, yeah. You kind of do get the. I don't necessarily know. Maybe there's a place biblically where we see this, but I get the sense that Jesus was a joyful person. He was a stern person. He had his moments, right? I mean, he was a person of emotion and passion. But I suspect when he was telling stories about the lilies of the valley and the birds of the air, I bet he had some joy in telling some of those stories that he told. Yeah. Good. So transformation is the key word. We want to be transformed into the image and likeness of Christ. And to do that, we're going to have to look at these false narratives. The false narratives about who God is that we've sort of taken on in our own lives, in our own beings. I believe God is this way or that way. Come to find out that's actually not quite true. Now, the false narrative that our chapter is going to put in front of us is the narrative that we change by our willpower. We change by our willpower. We change by trying harder. We change by trying harder to make the things work. I'm going to try to be more patient. I'm going to try to be more joyful. I'm going to try to be more peaceful. Everybody try those things before? Those of you that want those things, have you tried it? I've tried to be more patient, right? And that may work for a time, right? But what inevitably happens, right? We fall back into some of those other things. And if we're going to have transformation, it's going to be transformation that takes and takes a hold and shapes who we are for the long haul. That's what we're after. Well, I'm going to stop there for now because that's where the questions that our leaders have are designed to pick you up from. Be talking about this false narrative we change by our willpower. And what I like about this book is it's going to hold up the narrative of Jesus against these false narratives and help us find ways to live into them. So, blessings as you go into your groups and as you begin your discussion.